There comes a moment when loyalty feels like self-betrayal, when the people who gave you life begin to drain the life out of you. In that moment, a terrifying question appears: if I walk away from my own family, who do I become? Most people never answer it. A rare few do, and it changes them forever. Today, we explore why cutting off family can become the final psychological test for the rarest kind of personality, not as rebellion, not as cruelty, but as an act of painful consciousness. This is not a talk about hatred. It is a talk about individuation, the becoming of who you truly are. We are born into stories we did not write, yet we are expected to live them as if they were our own. Before we speak our first word, meaning has already been placed upon us. A name is given, expectations quietly arranged, roles subtly assigned. Long before choice appears, identity is shaped. For most people, this inherited structure provides safety. It answers the terrifying question of who they are without demanding inner confrontation. To belong is easier than to become. Family is the first psychological universe we inhabit. It teaches us what is acceptable, what is dangerous, what earns love, and what invites punishment. It defines what is called normal with such authority that questioning it feels unnatural, even immoral. Within this system, a child quickly learns how to survive emotionally. One becomes the achiever to bring pride, the peacemaker to prevent conflict, the invisible one to avoid harm, or the scapegoat to carry tensions no one else will face. These roles are rarely spoken, yet they are deeply enforced. For many, these roles harden into identity and remain unquestioned for life. But there are some individuals who experience an early, quiet disturbance. Not a rebellion, not hatred, just an unease that grows with time. They sense that something about their role feels borrowed, as if they are living slightly out of alignment with themselves. Success does not feel fulfilling. Obedience does not feel virtuous. Even praise feels hollow, because it rewards the mask rather than the soul behind it. Psychological observation confirms this inner conflict. Family systems do not operate on individual truth, they operate on balance. Each member unconsciously adjusts to maintain emotional equilibrium. When one person begins to change, by setting boundaries, questioning beliefs, or healing old wounds, the system perceives it as a threat. Resistance emerges not because the change is harmful, but because it destabilizes what was familiar. The family would rather preserve a dysfunctional balance than risk the unknown. This is why growth is often punished in families that rely on unconscious roles. The individual who begins therapy, self-reflection, or emotional maturation may suddenly be labeled difficult, selfish, or arrogant. These labels are not diagnoses, they are defenses. They serve to pull the individual back into their assigned position. The system says, in effect, become who you were again, so we do not have to change. Consider the adult child who spent years carrying emotional burdens that were never theirs. They listened, absorbed, soothed, and sacrificed. Their worth was measured by how much they endured. After years of inner work, they stop over-explaining, stop rescuing, stop apologizing for existing. Nothing about them becomes cruel. They simply become clear, and clarity, in an unconscious system, feels like aggression. The family reacts not to who this person has become, but to what they no longer provide. For the rare personality, this moment is unbearable. Awareness presses against the walls of the old identity like a force of nature. To remain in the role now feels like self-betrayal. The individual realizes that their exhaustion, anxiety, or emptiness was not a personal failure, but a signal that the self had been exiled to keep peace. Awareness changes the relationship to suffering. Pain is no longer something to endure blindly, it becomes meaningful. The individual sees that their distress has a purpose, to force a confrontation between who they are and who they were trained to be. Once this insight appears, there is no return to innocence. One cannot unknow what has been seen. One cannot convincingly play a role that has been exposed as false. This is where fear intensifies. To step out of the role feels like stepping into nothingness. The family identity, however limiting, provided orientation. Without it, the individual faces an inner void. But this void is not emptiness, it is potential. It is the space where a real self may emerge, if one has the courage to endure the uncertainty. The rare personality understands, often painfully, that belonging purchased at the cost of authenticity is too expensive. They recognize that love conditioned on compliance is not love, but contract, and breaking that contract feels like treason not only to others, but to the internalized voices that have governed them since childhood. Yet the psyche seeks wholeness, not comfort. It will sabotage any identity that prevents growth. Symptoms appear not to destroy the individual, but to save them from living half a life. Anxiety, depression, and chronic dissatisfaction often arise not from weakness, but from prolonged disobedience to the self. When awareness awakens inside a false role, it becomes a slow burning fire. One can suppress it for years, but it will surface again, in relationships, in health, in dreams. Eventually, the individual must choose remain loyal to the story they inherited, or answer the call of the life that seeks to be lived through them. This is not an act of rejection. It is an act of differentiation. It is the moment the individual separates psychologically from the family's unconscious demands and begins the difficult work of becoming an individual rather than a function. And once this process begins, it cannot be undone. Awareness does not negotiate, it insists. For those who experience it, the invisible prison of family identity is not shattered by anger, but dissolved by truth. And truth, once seen, does not ask permission to exist. When distance begins, guilt arrives quietly, almost politely, wearing the language of duty and love. It does not shout at first. It whispers. It reminds you of sacrifices made, of years invested, of expectations you never consciously agreed to, but somehow inherited. You owe us. We did everything for you. This is just how family is. These sentences carry a peculiar power because they do not sound like control. They sound like morality. And that is precisely why they are so effective. Guilt is often mistaken for conscience, yet the two are not the same. Conscience arises from inner alignment, from a felt sense of rightness rooted in one's own values. Guilt, in many families, is externalized conscience, installed early, reinforced often, and activated the moment separation threatens the existing order. It is less a moral compass and more a psychological tether. Its function is not to guide the individual toward truth, but to pull them back into place. In families where love was conditional, guilt becomes the currency of belonging. Affection is given when expectations are met and withdrawn when they are not. Over time, the child learns that saying no risks emotional exile. They learn to associate self-assertion with harm and compliance with safety. This lesson settles deep in the psyche, far below rational thought, where it continues to operate long into adulthood. Research on emotional enmeshment supports what lived experience already knows. In enmeshed systems, individuality is perceived as abandonment. Boundaries are interpreted as rejection. Autonomy feels like betrayal. When one member begins to separate psychologically, the system reacts not with curiosity, but with alarm. Guilt is deployed to restore closeness, not healthy closeness, but dependency. The rare personality feels this guilt more sharply than most. Their sensitivity makes them acutely aware of emotional undercurrents. They pick up on disappointment before it is spoken, on disapproval before it is named. This makes guilt especially potent. Yet what distinguishes them is not the absence of guilt, but their willingness to examine it rather than obey it. At some point, a question emerges in the quiet moments after the accusation, after the heavy silence, after the subtle withdrawal of warmth. The question is simple, but dangerous: is this guilt coming from my conscience or from someone else's fear of losing control? This question changes everything. It turns guilt from an authority into an object of reflection. Once examined, guilt often reveals its true origin. It is not rooted in harm caused, but in discomfort provoked. The individual did not wound, they differentiated. They did not abandon, they stepped back. Yet the emotional reaction they receive suggests a crime has been committed. This mismatch creates deep confusion until clarity finally breaks through. Growth has been misinterpreted as cruelty. Consider the woman who grew up as the emotional container of her family. She listened endlessly, absorbed pain that was not hers, and learned early that her role was to be available, agreeable, and endlessly understanding. When she finally began to set boundaries, nothing dramatic occurred. She simply said no when she was overwhelmed. She limited conversations that left her depleted. The response was swift and cold. She was called distant, ungrateful, even heartless. Yet months later, something remarkable happened. Her chronic anxiety faded. Her sleep improved. Her body relaxed. Nothing about her became worse, only clearer. This clarity is what the system resists most. A person who is clear can no longer be easily manipulated. Guilt loses its power when it is recognized as a tool rather than a truth. But reaching this recognition is not easy. It requires enduring the accusation without rushing to self-betrayal. It requires tolerating the discomfort of being misunderstood without immediately trying to correct the narrative. For many, this is the most painful stage of psychological development. To disappoint one's family feels like an existential threat because early belonging was tied to survival. The nervous system reacts as if exile were imminent. This is why guilt feels so overwhelming. It activates ancient fears of abandonment. But the rare personality slowly learns to sit with this fear, to breathe through it, and to notice that the feared catastrophe does not occur. What does occur, however, is a shift in internal authority. Instead of asking, "How do I make them comfortable?" the individual begins to ask, "What is true for me?" This is not selfishness. It is the birth of responsibility toward the self. Without this shift, the individual remains psychologically dependent, forever living in reaction to others' expectations. Growth often feels like betrayal to those who benefit from your silence. When you stop absorbing what does not belong to you, those burdens do not disappear, they return to their rightful owners. This return is rarely welcomed. It exposes dynamics that were previously hidden. It forces others to confront what they avoided by leaning on you. Guilt, then, becomes a protest against this exposure. Yet the psyche does not mature through obedience to guilt. It matures through discernment. True ethical development requires the ability to distinguish between guilt that signals harm done and guilt that signals resistance encountered. One shrinks the soul, the other expands it. As this distinction becomes clearer, the individual begins to experience a strange paradox. They feel more alone, yet more solid, more uncertain, yet more real. They may grieve the fantasy of unconditional acceptance from those who could not give it. But in that grief, something authentic begins to take root, a sense of self not governed by fear. Guilt loses its grip not through rebellion, but through understanding. When seen clearly, it no longer commands. It informs, it warns, but it does not rule. And in that shift, the individual steps out of emotional captivity and into psychological adulthood, no longer driven by the need to be forgiven for becoming who they are. Cutting off family does not bring instant peace, despite what the hopeful mind may secretly wish. There is no sudden relief, no immediate sense of freedom. Instead, what arrives first is silence, and silence is terrifying because it removes the familiar noise that once told you who you were. Even when that noise was painful, it was known. The absence of it feels like standing in an empty landscape with no landmarks, no echoes, no reassurance that you still exist in relation to something. Human beings are shaped for belonging long before they are shaped for truth. From the earliest stages of life, connection is survival. Modern neuroscience confirms what the body has always known. Social rejection activates the same regions of the brain as physical pain. Exclusion hurts because, for most of human history, it meant death. This is why people remain in emotionally destructive family systems far longer than logic would suggest. The nervous system would rather endure familiar pain than risk the terror of isolation. When someone chooses distance from family, the body often reacts as if a vital organ has been removed. There is restlessness, doubt, grief, and an almost irresistible urge to return, not because the old environment was healthy, but because it was familiar. The psyche equates familiarity with safety, even when evidence suggests otherwise. This is why the decision to stay away requires more than insight. It requires endurance. The rare personality understands something that cannot be learned intellectually. They sense that there is a fate worse than loneliness, and that fate is permanent self-abandonment. To remain connected at the cost of one's inner truth slowly erodes the soul. It produces a life that looks functional from the outside, but feels hollow within. Over time, the individual may lose the ability to hear their own thoughts, to feel their own needs, to trust their own perceptions. The period following separation is a psychological wilderness. Old identities dissolve. The roles that once provided structure no longer apply. The obedient child, the fixer, the emotional anchor, all fade, leaving behind a question that has no immediate answer. Who am I without this function? This question cannot be rushed. Any attempt to fill the void too quickly risks replacing one false identity with another. In this wilderness, time behaves differently. Days feel longer. Decisions feel heavier. Without constant feedback from familiar relationships, the individual must confront themselves directly. This confrontation is uncomfortable because it reveals how much of one's sense of self was constructed in response to others. Yet it is also the beginning of something real. This is where most people turn back. The discomfort becomes too intense, the loneliness too sharp, the uncertainty too destabilizing. They return not because they were wrong to leave, but because the in-between is unbearable. It requires sitting with unanswered questions and unresolved emotions without numbing them through distraction or submission. Those who endure this passage often describe it not as a period of happiness, but of honesty. There is grief for what never was, anger for what was endured, fear of what lies ahead. Yet beneath these emotions, a subtle shift begins to occur. A new center of gravity forms within the psyche. External approval slowly loses its authority. The constant internal question, am I allowed to be this, begins to fade. In its place emerges a quieter, steadier voice. It does not shout, it does not demand. It simply states, this is who I am. This voice is not inflated or defensive. It does not seek validation. It carries a sense of inner permission that cannot be revoked by disapproval. This internal authority is not arrogance. It is alignment. It comes from having faced the fear of aloneness and discovering that the self does not dissolve in its presence. On the contrary, it becomes more defined. The individual learns that being alone does not mean being empty. It means being unoccupied by false demands. The loneliness of this phase serves a purpose. It strips away borrowed identities. It forces the individual to sit with their own values, desires, and limits. What once felt like abandonment slowly reveals itself as initiation. A passage from dependence to psychological adulthood. Over time, the silence changes. What was once terrifying becomes spacious. The absence of constant emotional noise allows previously unheard aspects of the psyche to speak. Creativity returns. Intuition sharpens. The individual begins to experience moments of peace that are not dependent on anyone's approval. This does not mean the longing for connection disappears. The desire for relationship remains, but it transforms. The individual no longer seeks belonging at any cost. They seek resonance. They choose connections that allow mutual recognition rather than role-playing. Loneliness, once endured, teaches discernment. In this way, the rite of passage completes its work. The individual who entered the wilderness afraid of disappearing emerges with a stronger sense of presence. They no longer cling to relationships out of fear. They enter them out of choice. The silence that once threatened them becomes a source of strength, a reminder that their existence is no longer defined by who is watching. What begins as loss slowly reveals itself as foundation. Not the foundation given by others, but the one built within. And from that foundation, a life can be lived that does not ask permission to be real. Trauma travels through families like an inheritance no one openly acknowledges, yet everyone unconsciously obeys. It does not arrive with names or explanations. It hides in tones of voice, in sudden silences, in reactions that seem disproportionate to the moment. Long before a child understands language, They are already learning what love costs, what anger means, and what must be suppressed to remain safe. In this way, pain becomes tradition, passed down not through intention but through repetition. Modern trauma research now confirms what ancient wisdom intuited: unresolved suffering does not disappear with time. It changes form. It moves through behavior, attachment styles, nervous systems, and emotional reflexes. A parent who was never allowed to feel becomes emotionally distant. A parent who lived in chaos becomes rigid and controlling. What was once a survival strategy hardens into a personality trait, then is handed to the next generation as just the way we are. Most people live inside these patterns without ever seeing them. They feel the effects but never question the source. They normalize emotional absence, volatility, or conditional love because it is familiar. Familiarity is mistaken for truth. The rare personality, however, experiences something different. They do not only suffer the pattern, they observe it. There is a split in consciousness where pain is accompanied by awareness. They notice that addiction appears in different forms, but carries the same function: escape. They see how emotional neglect is disguised as discipline, praised as toughness, and defended as character building. They sense that affection is given not freely, but in exchange for obedience, loyalty, or achievement. Love becomes something to earn, not something to rest in. This noticing is not comfortable. It creates inner conflict. To see the pattern is to see one's family not only as victims of circumstance, but as participants in a cycle they never questioned. This realization brings grief, anger, compassion, and confusion all at once. It would be easier not to see. Yet once seen, the pattern cannot be unseen. At some point, a radical thought emerges, often quietly, without drama: this ends with me. Not as a declaration of superiority, but as an act of responsibility. The individual realizes that healing is not only personal, it is ethical. To continue the pattern is to pass forward what was passed to them. To interrupt it is to bear the weight of change alone. This decision is rarely celebrated. Families invested in unconscious continuity experience it as rejection. They interpret boundaries as judgment, distance as punishment. But in truth, cutting off family in such cases is not rejection. It is containment. It is the conscious choice to stop the spread of psychological poison. Just as one isolates a toxin to prevent contamination, the individual isolates themselves from dynamics they refuse to perpetuate. Containment requires strength, because it often means holding pain without discharging it onto others. The individual must feel what previous generations avoided. They must experience emotions that were numbed, denied, or displaced. This is exhausting work, yet it is also transformative. What was once acted out becomes felt. What was once inherited becomes integrated. Many who take this path later become healthier parents, partners, and leaders, not because they had perfect models, but because they studied failure deeply. They learned to listen because they were unheard. They practice presence because absence shaped them. They value emotional honesty because silence once ruled their inner world. Their leadership is not built on authority, but on awareness. Breaking an ancestral pattern does not mean rejecting one's origins. It means relating to them consciously rather than compulsively. The individual no longer lives as a vessel for unfinished business. They become a point of interruption in the flow of unconscious repetition. This is psychologically significant because it marks the transition from being lived by the past to living toward the future. There is often loneliness in this position. To stand outside the pattern is to stand alone. Others may accuse the individual of exaggeration, of being too sensitive, of dwelling on the past. These accusations serve a purpose. They protect the pattern from scrutiny. But the rare personality understands that denial is not strength. It is merely silence in disguise. Over time, the individual begins to feel a subtle but profound shift. Relationships become choices rather than obligations. Authority is no longer confused with fear. Love no longer requires self-erasure. These changes ripple outward, even if unacknowledged. Children raised by someone who has done this work feel it in the atmosphere. They grow up with permission to feel, to question, To be human, the cost of breaking the ancestral pattern is high. It demands courage, patience, and the willingness to be misunderstood. But the cost of not breaking it is higher. It is paid in anxiety, emotional disconnection, and the quiet despair of repeating a life that was never truly chosen. Those who carry this burden often do so without recognition. There are no ceremonies for psychological pioneers, yet their impact is enduring. By refusing to repeat what was unconscious, they create a future that is not haunted by the past. And in doing so, they honor their lineage not by imitation, but by transformation. This path is not about erasing family from the heart, because the psyche does not work through erasure. What has shaped us cannot simply be deleted. The early figures of our life live on within us as images, voices, expectations, and emotional reflexes. To pretend otherwise is to fall into denial. The task is not to destroy these inner presences, but to change our relationship to them. Maturity begins not when the past disappears, but when it no longer governs. For a long time, family occupies the driver's seat of the inner life. Their approval determines worth. Their disappointment defines failure. Even in physical absence, their authority remains active within the psyche. Many people spend their entire lives reacting to this inner committee, trying to please it, defy it, or escape it, without ever realizing that the true work is neither obedience nor rebellion, but integration. Revenge is a temptation when one awakens to how much was lost or distorted. Anger has a rightful place. It signals violated boundaries and denied needs. But when anger becomes the guiding principle, it merely reverses the direction of dependency. Hatred still binds the individual to what they claim to have left behind. The psyche does not become free by fighting its origins. It becomes free by assimilating them consciously. True psychological maturity demands the ability to hold opposing truths at the same time. One may love one's family and still require distance. One may feel compassion for their wounds and still refuse to carry them. This tension is difficult because the human mind longs for simplicity, good or bad, loyal or disloyal, right or wrong. Integration asks for something harder, complexity. Some individuals, after long inner work, find that reconnection becomes possible. But it is no longer driven by longing or fear. It arises from strength. They can engage without shrinking, speak without over-explaining, and leave without collapsing into guilt. In such cases, contact is no longer an unconscious reenactment, but a conscious choice. The relationship may be limited, imperfect, and still meaningful. Others never reconnect, and this too can be a sign of integration rather than bitterness. Peace does not require physical closeness. The psyche knows when distance is the most loving boundary available. What matters is not the form of the relationship, but the absence of compulsion. When contact or non-contact no longer defines one's identity, integration has occurred. At this stage, something subtle but profound shifts. The individual is no longer living someone else's unlived life. They are no longer attempting to fulfill dreams that were abandoned by previous generations, or compensating for emotional deficits they did not create. The unconscious contract has been broken. Life energy that was once bound to obligation becomes available for creativity, intimacy, and purpose. This liberation does not come without cost. To step out of inherited expectations is to risk rejection, not only external, but internal. The inner child still longs to be chosen, approved of, welcomed without conditions. Facing the possibility that this may never happen is one of the deepest fears a human being can encounter. It touches the ancient terror of exclusion, of not belonging to the tribe. Yet those who endure this confrontation discover something unexpected. The feared annihilation does not occur. The psyche bends, but it does not break. In surviving the loss of imagined acceptance, the individual gains something real: self-trust. They learn that their existence does not depend on permission, that their worth is not granted by others, but inherent. Integration means the family story is no longer denied, nor allowed to dominate. It becomes one chapter in a larger narrative. The individual can acknowledge what was given and what was missing without being consumed by either gratitude or resentment. Memory becomes information, not a command. This integrated position allows for compassion without self-sacrifice. One can see the wounds of previous generations without romanticizing them. One can understand without excusing, forgive without forgetting, and love without surrendering autonomy. This is not emotional coldness, it is emotional clarity. At this level, identity is no longer reactive. The individual is not defined by opposition or compliance. They move from an inner center that feels steady, quiet, and self-authorized. Decisions arise from alignment rather than fear. Relationships are chosen for resonance rather than familiarity. What emerges is something rare, a self that does not need permission to exist. This self does not announce itself loudly. It does not seek constant validation. It simply lives, grounded in an inner yes that is not dependent on applause or approval. It can stand alone without bitterness and connect without losing itself. This is the hidden reward of integration, not superiority, not vindication, but wholeness, a state in which the past has been faced, felt, and placed where it belongs, behind, not beneath. The individual no longer runs from their origins, nor remains imprisoned by them. They carry their history consciously, and because of that, they are finally free to live a life that is truly their own. Cutting off family is not for the weak. It is for those who value truth over comfort, consciousness over conformity, and becoming over belonging. Not everyone is meant to take this path, but for the rare personality, it is not a choice. It is the final test. And passing it does not make you heartless, it makes you whole.